All right, you may have already looked up my bio, but in case not, I'm Steve Greene, so if you were looking for someone else, you can leave now and I won't be offended, since I can only be me. I'm Steve Greene. I'm director of Keno Catechetical Institute at the Diocese of Phoenix. I took the liberty of doing some shameless self-promotion and throwing up a bunch of information. In the unlikely event that you haven't had your fill of me by the end of this morning's presentation, or you want additional time off purgatory, you can hunt me down at any one of those locations, and I'll be happy to interact with folks there. But we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's jump right into it. I am a Franciscan University graduate. I graduated here at the end of the last millennium in 1996. I was an English lit major with a minor in history, but because canon law states that all Franciscan University graduates are required at some point to be a youth minister, when I left Franciscan with my English degree in hand, I moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and I ended up in youth ministry. So as a youth minister, to be perfectly honest, I was long on show and short on wisdom, right? Snap and sizzle, not a whole lot of substance. Again, I was an English lit major, right? But as a youth minister, I did my best. And there's a kid in our youth ministry, I'll call him Brian. That's not his real name. His real name is Kyle. So anyway, so Brian was a really bright kid. He was going to a Catholic school run by an order that begins with J, and I'll just leave it there. And Brian approached me and he said, "Hey, Steve, could we go to lunch sometime? Like, I've got some questions that I'm getting at school that are like really bugging me. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to respond." I'm like, "Okay, sure, Brian, no problem, man." So we went to lunch, we got some cheeseburgers, and it turned out that the question that Brian was struggling with was the question of God's existence, atheism. So at his Catholic school run by an order that begins with J, he was getting pummeled by his teachers with the whole irrationality of the existence of God, and look at all the evil and suffering in the world, and how could God possibly exist and allow that to happen. So Brian was really struggling. And so he ran some of the questions that he was getting challenged with at school by me, because he wanted my response. My response, again, confession without absolution moment here, was laughably inadequate. The old English lit major was floundering in this conversation, and Brian was a bright kid. He was a sharp kid, so I was not going to run a bunch of nonsense by him and get away with it. So as the lunch went on, it got more and more embarrassing. To be honest, with me at the wheel, it was kind of a rough day for God and the Catholic Church. And then later, Brian went off to college. He became an atheist, and he's still an atheist to this day. And it's all my fault. No, I mean, the cheeseburgers were terrible, and they took forever to get there, too. I'm sure that played a role in it. But like I said, I didn't do God or the Catholic Church any favors that day. So now, fast forward a number of years from my burgers and bewilderment encounter with Brian, my son, we homeschool, my son Michael was in an enrichment program at one of the public schools, which has like a little side thing for homeschool kids. They can go there once or twice a week. So he came back from the homeschool enrichment program at the public school, and he said, "Dad, can I ask you a question?" "Sure." "How do you talk to atheists?" Oh, here we go. Now, I will say one of the benefits of my complete failure with Brian was, in the interim, I had done some studying. I had begun to read apologetics and watch and listen to stuff, so I'd try to kind of sharpen the sword a little bit, right? So that I was not only armed with an English lit degree if I ever had this conversation again. So here I am years later, now it's my son. And as it turns out, there was a kid in this homeschool enrichment program. I'll call him Brian, because that was his name. So real Brian, turns out, was an atheist, and he had seen my son and my son's little Catholic buddies saying grace before they ate lunch, before they tucked into their peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and whatever organic, non-GMO, dye-free snack their loving homeschool moms had packed for them. So they would say grace. Brian had noticed, and so at lunch one day, he just came up and he announced to my son and his friends that he was an atheist. and that his parents were atheists too. So I said to Michael, I'm like, oh, okay, really, it just came up. Yeah. So like, what did you say? He said, well, I didn't really know what to say, so I just said, oh, okay. And then I went back to eating lunch, which all things considered is probably about the best response a fifth grader can give when a kid approaches and offers him an unsolicited statement of his metaphysical commitments at lunch, right? So anyway, so Michael and I began this conversation about how do you talk to atheists. And by this time, I had been teaching philosophy and ethics at a local community college for a number of years, so I had had a lot of atheist students. So anyway, I kind of coached Michael up, I sent him back, and he began this kind of running conversation with Brian. And then eventually Michael's friends, his other little Catholic homeschool buddies, jumped in on it too. And so now Brian was faced with an apologetics team at his little homeschool enrichment program. I suspect that by the end of the semester, Brian probably wished he had never announced his atheism and maybe just gone with announcing his favorite sports team or something. Although, in the interest of full disclosure, had Brian announced his diehard love for the Chicago Bears, as a Packers fan, Michael and I would still have had a conversation about defective worldviews and praying for other people's conversion. So anyway, the point of all that, we never know when we're going to meet an ism, right? Case A with Brian, I got jumped by an ism and I was not prepared. And I got my rear end handed to me, right? Case B with real Brian, I had the chance to prepare myself, and so I was able to have a great kind of dialogue with my son and help him have a dialogue with his kid. I don't know. I mean, real Brian may still be an atheist. I don't know. Or maybe he's saying grace before his peanut butter and jelly now too. At any rate, what we're talking about today are these, what I call the deadly isms, right? These are, I like to refer to them as brilliantly bad ideas. And as we all know, we live in a culture that is being formed, or maybe more properly, deformed by these deadly isms, by these ideologies, these brilliantly bad ideas. So we're going to take a swing at them, see what progress we can make. So let me give you kind of my plan of attack for our time together. So first, I want to give you 3 takeaways, right? 3 kind of central ideas that I want you to bear in mind as we're talking about these deadly isms, but really more importantly, kind of 3 central themes to just continue ruminating on, contemplating as we all go out into the world to evangelize all nations and make disciples of all nations. Secondly, to kind of set it up, I want to give you just a very brief catechesis on the human soul, right? And I hope it'll make sense why I'm going to do that when I do it, but just to let you know that's what's coming. Third, I want to look just briefly and broadly at why these deadly isms are of such concern. Why is this something that we as Catholics and catechists need to be worried about anyway? Fourth, I want to introduce you to 5 of the most influential, read here, deadly isms that are poisoning our culture. Spoiler alert, I'll just give you the list. I want to talk briefly about atheism, about materialism, about existentialism, relativism, and then I'm going to wrap it up with socialism. Now, on your handout, those are all there. I threw a bunch of extra ones on there just for you to kind of play around with and mess around with. And like I said in the little caveat at the top of the handout, you're certainly most welcome to bring this handout to a cocktail party or Thanksgiving dinner, but I refuse to be held responsible if you never get invited back after you do. So, for each of the isms that we cover, I want to just define it briefly, give you a few thoughts on why it's dangerous, the damage that it can do, a brief Catholic critique of that ism. So none of this is going to be exhaustive, right? We don't have time to die. You could write a doctoral dissertation on all of these. But I want to take a brief look at kind of how the church would critique this ism. And then I want to make it a little more concrete and practical by just giving a real world example of where we see this ism in action. Thank you. Thank you. I'm selling water for $5 a bottle, so if anyone... Okay. And then fifth, what I want to do, I wanted to use all 5 of the isms that I just named to demonstrate how you can construct a cultural movement out of these isms. So I want to show you how you can stack and overlap these things to create one of the challenges that we're facing in our culture. And the one that I'm going to kind of use, build out of these isms is the LGBTQ plus movement. And then I'll just conclude with some thoughts on what we can do as Catholics to deal with these. So my hope is to pull this off and still leave us 10 minutes or so for Q&A. Yesterday, I had a chance to sit with a bunch of y'all afterwards and have a great conversation. Regretfully, I have an airport run waiting for me, so I will wrap up and then sprint out the door with my bag to head to Pittsburgh. But again, we can interact at any of those places if you'd like. Okay, so the 3 takeaways. Number 1, ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences. God gave us the gift of intellect and reason so that we could know the truth. So that means that if we reason well about reality, it leads us to truth and freedom. But conversely, if we reason poorly about reality, then it leads us into error and into sin. Second, our ancient enemy, Satan, never stops working to seduce our intellect into error. Satan never stops working to seduce our intellect into error because Satan knows that errors in the intellect breed errors in the will and errors in our passions and our desires, right? And then third, every anti-Christian ideology and cultural movement can be traced to bad ideas, to intellectual errors. Every anti-Christian ideology and cultural movement can be traced to bad ideas and intellectual errors. It would be bad enough if these isms that we're going to talk about today just affected individuals, but the enemy weaves them together to really undermine Christian culture as well. And don't we all know that, right? That's a newsflash to nobody in this room. Okay, so let's take a couple of moments to examine the human soul, the God-given powers of the human soul, and what that has to do with these deadly isms. So first of all, it might be good to ask, what is a soul? I'm going to use Aristotle's definition because it's just really clear and sharp and simple, and also accurate. Aristotle defines a soul as that principle which gives life and unity to a body. A soul is that principle which gives life and unity to a body. So when Aristotle talks about the soul, he says any living thing, plant, animal, human being, any living thing has a soul, a principle which gives life and unity to its body. There are different orders of soul. The plant or vegetative soul is the lowest in the order of principles that give life and unity to a body. It has the power to metabolize nutrients and reproduce. The animal soul is of a higher order. It's called the sentient soul because animals use senses, right? They see, they hear, they taste, they smell, they move through their environment in a way that plants don't. They interact and assimilate sensory data from their environment in a way that plants don't. But then the highest order of soul is the rational soul, or the human soul, right? And added to the vegetative and sentient powers of animals and vegetables, the human person has the power of reason, of intellect. And because we have the power of reason, of intellect, we also have the power of free will. We're able to know and we're able to choose. So we're self-determining in a way. So for Aristotle, the human animal, which he called a rational animal, is of a different kind. Not just different degree, we're not just higher and better than the other critters. We are a different kind. Why? Because of that rational soul. That's what makes us different. Now, of course, as Christians, we look at that and say, we say, yeah, right, good job, Aristotle. And where did we get that rational soul? God. God created it, right? He made us human beings with a rational soul, intellect, and free will so that we could know, will, choose, act, and ultimately so that we could love in the image and likeness of the God who created us. Okay, so the powers of the human soul are intellect, will, and appetite. I won't go into a whole thing on that, but there's a hierarchy, right? So intellect is the highest power of the human soul, and it is ordered to the knowledge of the truth. Ordered to means the reason God gave us the power of intellect, of reason, is so that we could know the truth. Will comes next, And will is ordered to choosing the good. The reason God gave us free will is so that we could choose the good. And then the lowest power of the human soul is appetite, and it's appetite that's ordered towards the satisfaction of our bodily needs. And notice what the three powers of the human soul are represented by, right? So intellect is represented by the head. It's the highest. Will is represented by the chest, the heart, right? The passion, the drive. And then, of course, the appetites are represented by the gut and the loins. They correspond to just the basic human needs: food, drink, sex, reproduce the species, fend off predators, etc. Okay, great. When the powers of the human soul are well ordered, then we function as human persons well. When the intellect is truly aimed at truth, when the will is truly aimed at the good, and when the appetites just take care of our basic physical needs, everything works great. Plato actually used the analogy of a chariot. He said the intellect is like the chariot driver, the will or the passions, the drive, the heart, the chest. That's like the lead horse, the big, strong, fast horse. And the appetites are like the trail horse that need to be led both by the lead horse and by the charioteer, or they get out of order. And Plato said, and of course as Christians we get this too, if disorder is introduced into the hierarchy of intellect, will, and appetite, then things get messy, right? If the charioteer steps out from behind the wheel and the trail horse, the appetite horse, gets in the driver's seat, you end up wheels up in a ditch in short order, right? Same thing, if the lead horse takes over and the intellect, the charioteer, is no longer steering him, the lead horse will take that thing right into the side of a mountain. He'll smash it in a minute. So the intellect has to run the show. Okay, so what's the problem then? The problem is that after the fall, the two primary effects of the fall in the human soul. So we know shame enters in, right? They went from being naked and unashamed to suddenly hiding themselves. They realize it can be used. But what effect did it have in the powers of the human soul? The intellect is now darkened. So sin darkens the intellect, meaning we now struggle to see the truth. And it weakens the will, meaning we now struggle to choose the good. So after the fall, all of us, and we know this, struggle with a darkened intellect. We struggle to see the truth, and a weakened will. We struggle to choose the good. Into that reality comes the enemy with these deadly isms, seeking to seduce the intellect, because he knows Satan is the consummate student of human nature, right? He's an expert on the thing he wants to destroy. He knows how God created and ordered the human soul and the powers of the human soul. And he knows that the first move in introducing disorder and chaos into the human person is to introduce errors into the intellect. He seduces the intellect into the error because he wants to direct us away from the truth. He knows that the truth sets us free, and Satan doesn't want us to be free. He wants us to be slaves to sin. Okay, so I said before, ideas have consequences. For good or ill, what we think and believe, how we understand and perceive reality, eventually guides how we choose and act, right? So every philosophy eventually breeds an ethical or a moral system, and every moral system, to the extent that it informs the moral thinking of people and public policy, eventually is a matter of life or death for someone, right? Immoral systems eventually damage people. They eventually destroy people. These isms then, and there are so many more to choose from. Even your handout, I could have added 30 pages to it. But these isms are successful seductions of the intellect. What you're looking at when you're looking at these deadly isms are just bad ideas. I say brilliantly bad ideas because the guys that come up with them are smart fellas, right? But they're brilliantly bad ideas that are just the enemy successfully seducing the intellect into error and then leveraging those intellectual errors to wreck stuff, to just cause damage and chaos and destruction. Okay. This is problematic because, of course, in reality, which is where we want to remain, there are no consequence-free compromises of the truth. There are no consequence-free compromises of the truth. When we compromise the truth, we will pay for it somehow, some way, someday. And of course, the bigger and more frequent the compromises we make with the truth, the bigger the bill. So here's a newsflash to nobody. We live in a culture that is compromising the truth all day, every day. And we are starting to see just how costly these compromises can be. So each of these deadly isms then is not only a little seduction of the intellect, but it's also a compromise of the truth. So each of these comes with a cost. It's also worth pointing out, though, that these errors, these brilliantly bad ideas, these deadly isms, are not just naturally occurring phenomena, right? Like waterfalls, mountain ranges, or Hillary Clinton not achieving her political ambitions. These errors are brilliantly bad ideas because they originate with really smart people, usually philosophers, people who are a lot smarter than me anyway. As my dear old professor Gil Ring used to say, when he was teaching these same deadly isms in philosophy class, he'd say, you have to be awfully smart to come up with an idea this stupid. He would also say, no one's in danger of being led astray by the village idiot, let's be honest. But when the smartest guy in town goes off the rails, he's dangerous because he'll persuade people and he'll take people with him, right? Okay, so sadly in the last several centuries, some of the brightest and best minds have rejected the truth. They've been seduced into these intellectual errors. And by seeking novelty and often an intellectual following, you can be really popular if you create your own deadly ism. Don't do it. But if you did, you'd get a lot of people who would be really super excited to read your books and attend your lectures, et cetera, et cetera. So as these intellectual errors multiplied, though, in the last several centuries, they've really begun to eat away the Christian roots of our culture. They begin to undermine and slander the luminous intellectual tradition that we are blessed to inherit as Catholics. In the 1950s, a social philosopher named Will Herberg, who's actually Jewish, philosopher, theologian, he was observing the culture. Remember this, he's saying this in the 1950s. He's observing the culture and its drift away from its Judeo-Christian roots. And he made the following observation. I'm going to quote him. He says, the attempt made in recent decades by secularist thinkers to disengage the moral principles of Western civilization from their scripturally based religious context, in the assurance that they could live a life on their own as a humanistic ethics, has resulted in, and this is the phrase that he coined, a cut flower culture. That's a really interesting, here's what he means, a cut flower culture. He says, cut flowers retain their original beauty and fragrance, but only so long as they retain the vitality that they have drawn from their now severed roots. After that is exhausted, they wither and die. Brothers and sisters, I would submit to you that Will Herberg got it exactly right. We are living in a cut flowers culture in the West. We have severed ourselves from our Judeo-Christian roots, and although the fragrance and beauty of the culture remained for a while, I think what we see when we look at the culture around us and where it's going, we see the snowballing decay of flowers that are already fading and dying. So guess what? It falls to us to try to reconnect the cut flowers with the roots that we've severed them from. But in order to do that, we need to be familiar with these deadly isms. So in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 3 through 4, St. Paul brilliantly describes our cut flowers era when he says, "For the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own likings, and will turn away from listening to the truth and will wander into myths." Ding, ding, ding. Good job, St. Paul. Will Herberg was in the 1950s. St. Paul was 2,000 years ago. That's some pretty good prophesying right there, right? Okay, so we're going to examine some of these myths, take a good sober look at some of the consequences. So deadly ism number one, atheism And I'm going to do atheism / agnosticism, because if you talk with atheists, and I do from time to time, they insist it's kind of an umbrella term. You can't just peg us as people who state as a dogmatic creed that God doesn't exist. There's room for doubters and questioners, and we're okay, fine, no problem. What is it? Atheism / agnosticism is basically the belief that either God does not exist, or we cannot know if he exists, or if he exists, he's no longer present, active, or interested in the affairs of man. Which means that no matter which version you ascribe to, it boils down to the same thing, practically speaking. God is irrelevant, and we are on our own. Now, for my money, the paradigm thinker for atheism is Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher who famously said, God is dead, and we are his murderers. Did you ever see those God Speaks billboards? They're like these big black and white billboards. They were all over the country. It would be like a quote, and then it's signed by God, like, love the wedding, invite me to the marriage, signed God. Or that love your neighbor thing, I meant that, signed God. I saw one once that said, Nietzsche is dead, signed God. Why is atheism and agnosticism dangerous? Gaudium et Spes number 36 from the Second Vatican Council says, without the creator, the creature disappears. When God is forgotten, spoiler alert, we live in a culture that has forgotten God, the creature itself becomes unintelligible. What creature are we talking about? Us, right? The human person. Okay. Because in God's absence, man becomes God. In God's absence, man will calculate the value of his fellow man. Here be dragons, buyer beware, right? If God does not exist, then the law of man is the highest law, and it answers to nothing above or outside itself. And notice that when I say the law of man, that can reduce all the way to the individual law of this man. If there is no God, I can be a law unto myself, with no law above me or outside me to modify or restrict my own lawmaking in any way. In Dostoevsky's brilliant The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan, who is an atheist, the character Ivan, who is an atheist, makes a really good observation. He says, if God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted. If God doesn't exist, all bets are off. Everything is permitted. We have freewheeling control over reality. We're a law unto ourselves. This inevitably results in might makes right, the perpetual battle to be the one sitting on God's throne. If he's not around, then we're going to compete for who gets to sit on that throne in his absence. There's no life nor any ultimate justice after death, right? So we are left with this is as good as it gets. The mess that we're all living in, sorry, what can I tell you? This is as good as it gets. There is no ultimate justice. There is no afterlife. There is no judge. This ultimately then devolves into Nietzsche's master morality. Nietzsche said we should overthrow and toss out the Judeo-Christian morality because it serves to preserve the weak and the pathetic and the botched and bungled to the detriment of the strong and capable. Nietzsche's call was for a revolution of the strong to rise up, throw off the Judeo-Christian morality, forge their own master morality as opposed to the slave morality of the Christians, and create a brave new world. That was Nietzsche's whole program. Okay. Atheism leaves human beings adrift with no meaning, no compass, and no guides in life, which means that we're perpetually vulnerable to being abused and used as human beings. Okay, what would be a Catholic critique? Let's begin with St. Paul again, Romans chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. He says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God and give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. St. Paul's really good at describing the 21st century, isn't he? I mean, you got to tip your cap to him. Okay, years ago, I was watching a debate on YouTube. I forget the participants. I should probably just go look it up again because I mention it all the time, and I always have to apologize. I don't remember who the participants were. But I remember one of them. There were two atheists pitted against two Christians. The debate question was, does God exist? And so they're going back and forth. One of the atheists was Lawrence Krauss. Lawrence Krauss is actually a professor at Arizona State University. He's an astrophysicist and an atheist. He wrote the book A Universe from Nothing, which purported to be an atheist explanation of how the universe could arise from nothing. Now, I'll just spoiler in case you don't have time to read the book. The book does not demonstrate that you can get a universe from nothing, but it amply demonstrates that you can write a book that amounts to nothing. So anyway, Lawrence Krauss was one of the atheists. And at one point, one of the Christians asked, this is the kind of the cross-examination part, one of the Christians asked Lawrence Krauss a great question. He said, what would it take for you to doubt your atheism? I mean, he's an atheist, he writes, he speaks, like it's kind of his side hustle, right? He's being an atheist. What would it take for you to doubt your atheism? I thought, ooh, that's a good question. This is what Lawrence Krauss said. He thought about it, he kind of smirked. He said, I guess if I walked out some night and looked up at the stars and they just formed themselves to say, I am here, I might have to have some doubts about my atheism. And everyone chuckles, and I'm sitting there and I'm waiting for the Christian to pounce. I'm like, oh my gosh, he just served himself to you on a silver plate. Nothing. Crickets. I'm a lunatic. I was yelling at the computer. I'm like, that's exactly what the stars say. It's just written too big for someone with such a small worldview to see it. This is what St. Paul is saying. All of nature says, I am here. It also says, I love you. It also says, I provide for you. It also says, I desire that you exist. It's written in the stars. It's written in the seas and the winds and the way. It's written in us, right? So I'm yelling. So if I ever get to debate Lawrence Krauss, you just wait for it. I guarantee, yeah. He's not clearing his calendar. He's not clearing his calendar for me at any time. Speaking of not knowing someone exists, right? Okay. G.K. Chesterton, in his typical G.K. Chesterton way, has this brilliant little observation to offer on the question of atheism. He says, if there were no God, there wouldn't be any atheists. Can't say it much better than that, actually. If there were no God, there wouldn't be any atheists. Okay, super. So, not content with biting the hand that feeds them, atheists have decided to deny the hand that made them. Atheism, of course, makes morality impossible. It's not. Now, I don't mean that the atheist you meet is necessarily this deeply monstrous, immoral person, but they don't have a receipt for that morality. They can't, from their atheist worldview, they cannot explain where they got it. Where did you get human equality and human rights and justice and the idea that people have values? Where did you get it? You didn't get that from atheism. Where did you get it? You stole it from us. I'll tell you what happens late at night when all the Christians are asleep. The atheists climb over the fence in the backyard. They steal all of our morality and our human dignity, the meaning and purpose in life, and they go back over the fence and pretend that they had that the whole time. Right? Okay. No, they can only get that from us. All right. Furthermore, atheism cannot explain a universe of contingent beings. What do I mean by contingent beings? It's a little philosophy term. Contingent beings simply mean receivers of existence. Things which exist but received their existence. We're all contingent beings. This desk is a contingent being. The self, meaning things that were caused to exist by something else, right? You can't have a universe of contingent beings without a necessary being. What's a necessary being? A necessary being is a being for which non-existence is impossible. Hint, we call that being God, right? So without God to give existence, we little receivers of existence couldn't exist. We do exist, therefore there is an eternal, necessary, uncaused giver of all existence. Right? Okay, so in atheism, once they kick out the necessary being, they're at a loss to explain. This is why you get people like Lawrence Krauss writing stupid books, like A Universe from Nothing. Okay, what's a real-world illustration? Look at the 20th century atheist regimes. Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Communist China, Communist Cuba, Cambodia, and look at the laundry list of atheist dictators, right? Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, Fidel Castro, Idi Amin, on and on and on. If atheists were willing to be completely honest, they would have to just take ownership of the body count of the 20th century. The bloodiest, deadliest century in human history by a power of 10, right? Why is it? What's the connection there? So if atheism is true, first of all, God has always been an obstacle to absolute human power, right? If God exists, I can't have absolute power. God kind of cramps my dictatorial style, my tyrant style. But God is also the foundation of the idea that human beings have value, that they have dignity, and they have worth. When you dismiss God from the picture, what value does a person have? Like I said, man will now calculate the value of his fellow man. What did all those atheist dictators use as a calculation for the value of their fellow men? Are you useful to the revolution? Are you playing ball with the revolution? Can you be used as a soldier or as a worker? If not, you're disposable. We can starve you to death. We can burn you up in gas chambers. We can blame all of our cultural problems on you and put you in concentration, on and on. So we know what this dynamic looks like. Without God to ground the dignity of the human person, man calculates the value of his fellow man. Here be monsters, and there stands the 20th century. So the modern atheist state is like Moloch, right? The demon god who demands human sacrifice. And boy, did he get a feast in the 20th century. All right, second deadly ism. Materialism, also known as naturalism. Materialism, what is it? It's the idea that all that exists is matter. Period. Full stop. Right? Everything which exists is nothing more than matter in motion, tumbling through the void of time and space, according to the immovable laws of physics. The paradigm thinker for this ism is Thomas Hobbes, who's one of the fathers of modern philosophy. So this means that what we have, if materialism is true, it's not, but if it was, then that would mean that everything that we have thought of as immaterial, right? The mind, the soul, the will, the memory, the imagination, the emotions, God, angels, is either an illusion, meaning it just doesn't exist and we've somehow been fooled into thinking it does, or it's just the byproduct of some biomechanical process, just the exhaust of biochemistry as little particles collide and recollide and combine and recombine. Why is materialism dangerous? First of all, because it denies everything spiritual in man and the universe, which is the loss, notice, of all the most important things. To lose the spiritual order of creation. Like I said, no God, no angels, no soul, no mind, no will, no afterlife, no justice. If man is just matter in motion, then again, this is an outgrowth. I start with atheism because it's sort of the foundational ism in a number of ways. Materialism is a subplot to atheism, and it carries the same themes through it, right? If we're just matter in motion, if we're just a buzzing cloud of atoms, a lump of stuff spit out by an uncaring, unnoticing universe, then what value do we value, right? What rights do we have? We don't have any rights. We're just a lump of stuff. We're just an accident of physics and evolution. This means also that morality is impossible, right? You can't tell a random clump of stuff that the universe just spit out at the end of a blind process of physics and evolution that it ought to do something, or it ought not to do something. Morality has nothing to get a grip on if we're just matter in motion. Having equality and human rights are also out the window. Materialism also entails determinism. Determinism is another ism. Again, they keep kind of branching off. Determinism just says, well, listen, matter and what matter does and how matter acts is all predetermined, right? It just obeys the laws of physics. It does what matter does because the laws of physics move matter, which means that if we're just clumps of matter, lumps of stuff, we are also predetermined. We're not free, and if we're not free, we're not responsible. In other words, if I was to, what's your name, sir?
Brian.
Brian, if I was to, wait, Brian or Brian? So if, five bonus points for you, Brian, made up name. So if materialism is true and Brian murders me, he's not responsible. He's just matter being shoved through the void of time and space by the laws of physics. And the laws of physics have brought that lump of stuff into a collision course with this lump of stuff, and this lump of stuff lost. Too bad for this lump of stuff, and on that lump of stuff. It's this ridiculous. It's this deadly. It's this dangerous. Okay, so Catholic critique. I would like to ask a materialistic question. I would say, help me understand, dear materialist. As a materialist, from your worldview, where do life, consciousness, and intelligence come from? As a materialist, to stay true to your worldview, where do life, consciousness, and intelligence come from? Why do I ask that question? Because matter is neither living, nor conscious, nor intelligent. So if there are beings in this universe, which for the materialist is nothing but matter, where did we get life? Where did we get consciousness? Where did we get intelligence? So there's a quote here. I know I said this is a Catholic critique, but interesting enough, it's not just Catholics that see the problem for the materialist here. There's a quote from atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel. He says, materialism is incomplete even as an account of the physical world, since the physical world includes conscious organisms as its most striking occupant. What Nagel is saying, and he's an atheist, he's avowed, Nagel is saying materialism just doesn't work. We need to abandon it and look for some other kind of theory because we're surrounded by conscious organisms, which are the most striking occupants of the physical world, right? Conscious organisms are the most interesting, the most complex, the most striking, and materialism can't account for them. Can't account for life, can't account for consciousness, can't account for intelligence. So in the absence of God, materialism is left with a universe that contains living, conscious, rational creatures, but on materialism has no sufficient explanation for those mysterious properties because matter can't give what matter doesn't have. And matter is not living, so it can't give life. It's not conscious, so it can't give consciousness. It's not intelligent. And to people who say, well, evolution and time and heat and pressure, and matter is like lumber or bricks. You can build really cool stuff out of it, right? Like a universe, for instance. But it can't build anything out of itself. It doesn't matter how long you leave a pile of bricks and lumber sitting there. Leave them sitting there for 13.5 billion years. It doesn't matter how much heat and pressure and change. It's just a pile of bricks and lumber. Unless and until some intelligent being comes and makes something out of it. Okay. Matter can't give what it doesn't have. Let's look at a real-world illustration. Euthanasia. is a good example of one of the cultural challenges we face that has rooted in materialism. Notice that euthanasia, of course, is the uglier version of assisted suicide. Assisted suicide, I decide it's time to end my life. Euthanasia, you decide it's time to end my life, right? So they're both bad, but euthanasia is even a bridge further. For a materialist, we're just purely material accidents of physics and evolution. So no soul, no spiritual elements, no afterlife, no God. Now, some of these material accidents either start badly or go bad, right? Some material accidents, humans, are deformed, defective, sickly, whatever, mentally disabled. And then eventually all of us go bad. We age, we get diseases, we contract terminal cancer, whatever. So for the materialist, these little evolutionary misfires, these clumps of stuff gone bad, tie up resources that are better allocated to the fit and the function, to the strong, to the healthy, to the powerful, to the beautiful. So for a materialist then, euthanasia is simply ridding ourselves of the worthless or malformed clumps of stuff. What Friedrich Nietzsche referred to as the botched and bungled, little evolutionary misfires, right? And since we're all just randomly combined matter on our way to extinction anyway, why not just dispose of the useless and burdensome now? Merciful for them, beneficial for us, win-win, right? Peter Kraft looked at this kind of nonsense, and he made a brilliant observation, because he's Peter Kraft, that's what he does for a living, makes brilliant observations. Kraft said, we have moved in our culture from a sanctity of life ethic to a quality of life ethic. That's really good. We have moved from a sanctity of life ethic, that's the Catholic Church, every life is sacred, to a quality of life ethic. That's the atheist, materialist, modernist. Well, what kind of a life would this unborn child who's been diagnosed with Down syndrome have? What kind of quality of life could they have? What kind of quality of life does grandma have now that she's dementia's setting in and her tumors are back, etc.? This is a monster breeding idea. Okay. Next. Where did I turn the page? Yeah, next deadlyism, existentialism. All right, what is existentialism? Existence precedes essence. That sounds weird. It's philosophy speak. We're thrust into existence, and that is the one single fact about us. We exist. Period. Full stop. From there, we choose and act blindly, since we have no reference to any reality outside ourselves or our own existence. And in so doing, for the existentialist, we begin to create our own natures. This is really weird and esoteric, but I want to walk us through it because it's actually everywhere in the culture right now. The paradigm thinker for existentialism is Jean-Paul Sartre, 20th century French philosopher and social commentator, public intellectual. So he says existence precedes essence, meaning when we're born, there's one fact about us. We are a thing which exists. We have no nature. We have no essence. We belong to no communities. We have no connections. We have no meaning. We have no purpose. We have no morality to God. We are dropped on a moonless midnight into a featureless landscape in the pitch dark. And we just have to lurch our way forward and begin choosing and acting. And as we choose and act, we literally forge a nature for ourselves. That's Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. Why is it dangerous? First of all, it's profoundly atheistic. And if God does not exist, again, then I am God. If atheism has proved one thing in history, it's that we make terrible, foolish, dangerous little gods. But this is exactly the project that existentialism launches us on. Existentialism sees other people as a constant threat to my freedom and to my self-defining life project. Sartre actually says hell is other people. Now, if you think about it, for an existentialist, you're just a thing which exists, And then you just begin creating your own project, your own nature, generating your own meaning. Of course, hell is other people. What do other people do to your project, to your prerogatives, to your pleasure? They wreck it. They impact it. They redirect it. They stifle and burden. I mean, goodness sake, you have kids. Kids don't do anything but screw up my project, right? What I want to do, what I want to be, how I want to spend my time and my money, right? Starts at hell is other people. Okay. It's a philosophy that shuns community and sees others as valuable only if you can use them to further your personal projects and pleasure. So if morality does not exist for the existentialist, it means I'm a law unto myself and I owe nothing to anyone outside myself. And if I am only a thing which exists and I have no nature or essence, then I'm also a species unto myself. I am that radically locked in my own project. I am my own separate, distinct, individual, self-determined species. All right. The problem with that is, of course, is that when things go badly, you have what? This is why it's called this. You have an existential crisis. When the little project of me goes off the rails, I suffer an existential crisis. Why? Because I am my own species. I am my own universe. I am my own law. And when it goes, there's nothing outside me that can help. I am alone in the universe, which means that existentialism hovers constantly on the brink of despair. And a culture of despair rapidly becomes a culture of death. So what would a Catholic critique be? First of all, existentialism views God, as well as others, as a threat to our freedom. Not just the existence of God, the very idea of God, which means that we have to throw off the idea of God, rid ourselves of that idea. Sartre actually admitted that his most difficult moments as an existentialist were the moments where he wished that God existed. It's a really interesting admission on his part. He said, yeah, there are moments where I wish there was a God. I wish there was meaning. I wish there was an afterlife. I wish there was justice. I wish there was equality in human. He was very honest as an atheist that way, as an existentialist. Said, no, all that stuff belongs to the Judeo-Christian worldview. I get that. We lost all that when we realized God doesn't exist. But he said those were his worst moments. Existentialism claims that the only authentic life is one lived entirely by one's own wit and wisdom, by one's own rules, and for one's own ends and pleasure. So any attempt to introduce morality, meaning, purpose, nature, essence from outside, Sartre calls inauthentic living and cowardice. You're just trying to comfort yourself with these fictions that there's a world and there's meaning and there's purpose and there's a God and there's justice. And none of that's true. So suck it up, Buttercup. You're alone in the universe. Create your own meaning. Run your own project and make the best of it that you can. Existentialists really mock the whole Judeo-Christian worldview and the whole Judeo-Christian morality. Nietzsche does the same thing. There's a close tie there. They mock it as being a worldview, a philosophy of morality for cowards, for babies, for timid little children that can't survive on their own, that can't live an authentic life, right? What's a real-world illustration? I won't belabor the point. Look at the mass shooters. What are you looking at when you see Columbine, Sandy Hook, Parkland, Mandalay Bay, Las Vegas, Uvalde? Last week, Highland, what are you seeing? You're seeing an existential crisis, is what you're seeing. You're seeing I'm not saying that all those angry, bitter, resentful, lonely, hurting young men that commit those terrible crimes, I'm not saying that they've read Jean Paul Sartre and signed in triplicate that this is now my word. No. That's the problem with these isms. They float, right? In the color, in the water, they're in the air. We just breathe them in. We ingest them. And whether you know you're drinking poison or not, it's still poison. And it still poisons you, right? The mass shooters are just walking existential crises. Their project, their little universe, their little self-created identity has hit the rocks, is falling apart, is coming unglued. And in their bitterness and resentment and despair, they just decide to take that out on existence itself. take out as many people as I can with them. All right, number 4, relativism. This one we're probably more familiar with. Relativism is just the idea that there is no objective truth, including no objective moral truth. So every person decides for themselves what is their truth and what's their morality. This is the, hey, listen, I won't impose my morality on you. You don't impose your morality on me, right? Like, don't impose your morality. Just live and let live, right? Or hey, that might be true for you, but that's not true for me, right? That it might. Hey, I'm cool, man. Like, it might be true for you that, you know, that little clump of cells in a woman's womb is a baby. Like, if that's your thing, dude, that's fine. But that's not true for me. That's not my truth. So just, you know, I'll leave you alone. You just leave me alone. Right? This is the bargaining chip of relativism. But of course, what does relativism do? It leaves us all adrift. What would be a Catholic critique of relativism? First of all, it saws off the limb it's sitting on. What's the thesis statement? There is no such thing as objective truth. So what should we ask as a Catholic? Is that statement objectively true? Just checking here. I'm just trying to do the math with you here, dear relativist friend. You're saying there's no objective truth, but that sounded like a objective truth statement to me. I've heard them before. That really sounds like one. And of course, they can't do anything with that. Because first of all, it's not true, right? There is objective truth. And we also know as Catholics that the truth is not just an abstract concept, but the truth is a person. The one who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And the truth will set us free. So we know that relativism actually enslaves us. It's a slick bait and switch job, relativism, because it proposes total freedom. If I can make up my own truth, if I can define reality for myself, if I can make up my own moral law, I'm totally free. Woo! Remember, behind it is the enemy. And what does he want? He wants us to walk away from the truth, because we won't find our truth. We'll just find error. We won't find freedom. That can only be had in the truth. We'll find slavery to sin. Pope Benedict XVI spoke of a dictatorship of relativism because he's really smart and he's really holy, right? Because it sounds like a contradiction in terms. Like, the one thing you can't get from relativism, because everyone's just free to make up their own truth, is a dictatorship. But here's the thing that people miss. To tell a lie, you have to deny the truth. To sell a lie, you have to silence it. To silence the truth, you have to be a dictator. You have to be a tyrant. You have to use force. So if we're going to be relativists, we're all making up our own truth, we're just going to be selling lies. We're going to be living lies. We're going to be saying things like, you know, the baby in the womb is not a human person, so it doesn't have human rights. We're going to be saying things like, I might genetically be a man, but if I say I'm a woman, then I'm a woman. We might be saying things like God. We're going to be selling all kinds of lies. And when we're selling lies, we can't have the truth walking around running its mouth because it messes up the whole project. So we have a dictatorship of relativism, because to sell a lie, you have to silence the truth. Okay. What would be a real life example? LGBTQ, the same-sex marriage movement, right? So one of the lies that our culture is selling is that two men can be married, and it's the same thing as a man and a woman, united in the sacrament of holy matrimony for the unity and procreation, unity of spouses, procreation of children. Yeah, two guys, same thing. That's a lie. But we have to enforce that lie by silencing the truth. Here comes the dictatorship of relativism, and here comes that reality that we build these cultural constructs out of these deadly isms. All right, last one, socialism. Socialism claims that the human race has always been divided into oppressors and oppressed. Two categories of human people through all of human history, period, full stop. You're either oppressed or you're an oppressor. It's no more subtle or nuanced than that. Progress, then, comes in the form of the oppressed rising up in revolution, or what Marx called class warfare against their oppressors, to seize power and then redistribute it equally to all. Yeah, right. Like, that's going to happen. Okay. The paradigm thinkers are, of course, Karl Marx, his buddy Friedrich Engels, and Antonio Gramsci, one of the most influential guys that no one has ever heard of. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Gramsci in a minute. Why is it dangerous? It's a philosophy of vengeance, violence, and victimhood. Socialism is a philosophy of vengeance, violence, and victimhood. It pits all persons in violent opposition to one another. It also eliminates the individual in favor of the state or the group or the revolution. So all of us sitting in these desks here today, or me, we have no value, we have no identity as an individual. We are completely defined and receive our value from our group or the revolution that we're marching in or the state. And this is a perfect inversion of the Catholic anthropology and Catholic political philosophy. It says the state exists for the citizen. Marxism, socialism says, no, the citizen exists for the state. Catholicism says we each have our own individual identity, our God-given. He has known us and loved us into existence from all eternity. We have a divine origin, we have a divine destiny. God is mindful of us. He's crowned us with honor and glory, says Psalm 8. And the socialist says, no. You are a little cog in the machinery of the state or the group or the revolution. That's all you are. You don't matter at all or to anyone beyond your little function as a little cog. And by the way, the flip side of that is, if your value and your identity is your functionality as a little cog in the machinery, the state or the group or the revolution, if you're not functioning well as a little cog, dispose of it. We're making other cogs. You can be replaced. You have no individual value or identity. It also creates perpetual victim groups, and it trains these perpetual victim groups to hate and resent and to blame everyone else for their victimhood. It makes citizens dependent on the state, and it excludes the citizen from the state. Okay. So as Catholics, we notice, again, this is a total inversion of the Catholic worldview. It obliterates solidarity and subsidiarity, these two principles of Catholic social teaching, meaning Catholic culture and society building. Solidarity means we're all in this together. We're brothers and sisters in one human family. We're responsible for each other. Socialism, that's complete garbage. No, you're not. No, it's every man, every group for themselves in constant competition. And subsidiarity says that problems should be solved and challenges met at the most local level possible. Socialism says, no, Big Brother will take care of everything for you. The state will take care of everything for you because you belong to the state. All right. The other thing is that socialism rejects and intentionally seeks to destroy all natural loyalties. Why? Because socialism requires complete and undiminished loyalty to the state or the group or the revolution. It will not tolerate competing loyalties. Well, what competing loyalties? Marriage, family, religion, tradition, locality. Marxism, socialism obliterates competing loyalties because it requires the citizen to belong entirely to the state or the group or the revolution. Look, here's a real world illustration. Identity politics and intersectionality. Now here's where Gramsci comes in. So Marx said, the revolution is coming, it's inevitable, and it's economic. Man is defined by his place in the economy. He's either one of the oppressed proletariat or he's one of the oppressive bourgeoisie. But mark my words, the revolution is going to happen. The proletariat, the workers, the oppressed are going to rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie, institute a socialist state where the state owns the means of production. It's going to distribute the products of the culture equitably, and then eventually we move to communism, which is the end game of socialism, which is a complete classless society. Well, it failed on every front. It failed spectacularly on every front. Marxism and socialism have created more poverty, more misery, more injustice, more exclusion, more inequality than anything else in human history. Complete failure. But that's no reason to stop pushing it, right? I mean, it takes someone really smart to come up with an idea that's stupid. So the intelligentsia are not going to give up that easily. Antonio Gramsci was a socialist. He had read Marx and Engels, but he made a key move. He said, you got it wrong. It's not an economic revolution. It's an intellectual revolution. And the way we do the revolution is we take over the education system. We take over the universities and we take over education and we begin to form and educate citizens to be good little socialists. Look at John Dewey and Horace Mann, who are the founders of public education in the United States. They are Gramscian socialists. They are building a system that churns out ka-chunk, 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 perfect little cogs for the machinery of the socialist state. This is the university system in the West. That's all Gramsci. He said we need the next generation. We get them by education. We start our revolution in the academy, and eventually that trickles down. And it's working. We look around, I don't need to convince you. Okay, so let's tie this all together then and look at the LGBTQ movement and how atheism, materialism, existentialism, relativism, and socialism come together to form the moment that we're in. And then I'll take questions. Okay, so starting with atheism, given that there is no God, so we are not beloved creations, but just random accidents, and there is no power higher than man to govern and guide things. That's atheism. Given that all that exists is matter, so there are no spiritual realities that survive death, like souls, minds, spirits, and this is the only life and world there is, and since our meaningless bodies can be manipulated, modified, or mutilated as we see fit, that's materialism. Given that existence precedes essence, and what we truly are at our birth is a featureless, natureless thing which exists, and it is therefore up to us to define ourselves and create our own natures and purpose and meaning, existentialism. Given that there is no objective truth or objective reality or objective morality, so it's up to each of us to decide for ourselves what is true, what is real, and what is good, relativism. And given that we are oppressed by traditional religious conservatives who are using their historical and institutional power to exclude and erase us, the time has come to rise up against our oppressors. That's socialism, which means that we of the LGBTQ plus community, along with our allies, should embrace and celebrate our journey of self-realization, self-creation. We should use and modify our bodies to make them fit ourselves as we perceive and define ourselves to be. We should declare our truth and our reality and not accept anyone else's attempt to limit, define, or shame us. We should rise up and raise a revolution against those who have historically oppressed and marginalized us and overthrow the institutions of oppression that have been leveraged against the LGBTQ community. And then use our power and our outrage to create a new society where we are protected, welcomed, and celebrated as we define ourselves to be. Voila. I give you the LGBTQ movement, brought to you by atheism, materialism, existentialism, relativism, socialism. This is how the deadly isms work. These are isms in action. Ideas have consequences. Our enemy knows it. Our enemy uses it. He seduces the intellect in error so that he can breed this kind of stuff. Destroy Christians, destroy Christian culture. Okay, so what are we to do about all this? A really interesting fact. I believe it's immigrations and customs. I think alcohol, tobacco, and firearms also, they have counterfeit currency divisions, meaning they have trained agents whose job it is to identify counterfeit U.S. currency coming into the United States. Do you know how they train counterfeit currency agents? There are a million ways you can counterfeit U.S. currency. Some are far more sophisticated. There's limitless possibilities for attempting to counterfeit U.S. currency. So counterfeit currency agents do not study the counterfeits. They become intimately familiar with every last detail of the real thing, so that when they come across a counterfeit, they just know it's off. They'll figure out why or how that's not the real thing. Brothers and sisters, we've been entrusted with the Catholic faith. We have been entrusted with the truth by the truth. So we need to learn our faith, live our faith, share our faith. We need to be intimately familiar with the real thing. So this begins, as we know, deepening our prayer life, deepening our sacramental life, studying Scripture, studying the Catechism of the Catholic Church, so that we have the grace and the wisdom we need to confront these deadly isms in the culture. And then, of course, we need to prepare to meet the suffering people who have ingested these poisoned ideas with love and mercy. And here's the good news. When we look at the culture, we look at the deep and destructive root that these isms have already taken, it's an unmeetable need. We do not have what it takes. But the good news is it's his work. It's not ours, right? We're like the apostles at the feeding of the 5,000.